Cast of characters. Upstairs, 10th Lord Grantham, George Crawley Jr., Georgie Dowager Harriet Crawley, George Jr.'s mother. Lady Margaret Westleton, George Jr.'s grandmother. Mrs. Mary Talbot, George Jr.'s grandmother. Mr. Henry Talbot, mechanic, retired, part owner of Talbot Parker Motors, Downton. Mrs. Caroline Lindsay, head teacher at the Lady Violet College, Basel, Switzerland. Marigold and Peter Pelham, aunt and uncle to Georgie Crawley. Tom Branson, somewhere in Era with his wife, Lucy, and son, Patrick Neil Branson, heir to the extinct title of Lord Inchiquin, claimant to the ruins and land at Daphne Castle. Sibby Hudson, Canada, wife of Scott Hudson, Royal Canadian Air Force, retired. Downstairs, Thomas Barrow, butler at Downton Abbey, semi-retired. Lawrence Parker, part owner of Talbot Parker Motors, Downton. Flora Ashby Barrow, cook, wife of Ernest Ashby Barrow, engineer and timepiece craftsman. Christopher Ashby Barrow, undergraduate at Manchester University and jeweller. Janet Ashby Barrow, pupil at Downton Girls' Grammar School and part-time companion to Mrs. Mary Talbot. Johnny Bates, groundskeeper at Downton Abbey. Anna Bates, retired lady's maid, Downton Estate Cottage. And other assorted cast. 88,888,888. 5th of August 1970. Thomas looked around at the hall, in the very center of the building. He had been in awe of it, when he had arrived, coming as he had done at the age of 9 as a hall boy by recommendation. Recommendation that he no longer needed to be in Manchester and in his father's sight. There has been so many servants, then. Now, just he, Florrie, Daisy and Andy Parker's daughter, and a couple of maids served Master George Jr. and his mother his granddaughter, Janet for Lady Mary, Johnny Bates for the heavy lifting. He could never have imagined the place so deserted and so empty. Despite Master George's efforts, his legal skill, his tenacity and diligence to the cause of keeping Downton solvent, he hadn't managed either to recoup money, nor had he made much effort in creating the next generation. Where would they be, should Downton end? It was a thought often on Thomas's mind, and he could now see the benefit of Ernest getting into partnership with his own brother, Henry. It had given Henry a new lease of business life while Ernest could suggest ideas and he and Henry could try them out, much as he had done when Thomas had given his younger brother the piezoelectric radio receiver that Milo had made, which Henry had made a prototype with, a sleek, elegant timepiece that also received radio broadcasts. For his next birthday after Milo's death, Henry had given it to Thomas. "Shouldn't you be at the farm?" Daisy sighed, as Thomas put down the menu for the day, not that there was much on it. Younger than Thomas by 6 years, Daisy had just celebrated her 72nd birthday, and still would not let her daughter Flora, Thomas's daughter-in-law, spend too much time alone in the kitchen. Not that there was anyone to cook for these days. Many days, Master George Jr. would eat alone, or at the Grantham Arms. "Can you imagine that happening in our day, Thomas?" Daisy was wont to suggesting. Thomas shook his head. "But did you ever think you'd still be here after all this time?" There was a silence, as the next generation Isis bounded over to Thomas. "He's around, then." "Must be. And I've organized you a special tea, seeing as it's a big birthday," Daisy told him, a grin on her face. Florrie did the cooking. Lord Grantham would have it served in the dining room. "Lady Mary is coming. We're all to come up." Thomas smiled. Daisy never lost her enthusiasm when it came to food, and twinkled at him like she used to do when she was much younger and didn't know that Thomas isn't for any woman, as Mrs. Batemore had put it. "I'm not 80 for another 2 years, he told Daisy, watching her face fall, and kicking himself silently for it. He followed her to the stairs, then up them. Daisy turned. "But, Lord Grantham doesn't have to know that, does he?" Daisy brightened, her joy coming back again as Thomas stepped past her and held the door that led to the hall ground floor. On the bottom step there was Janet sitting looking at a book, with Master Georgie beside her. She was pointing something out to him. "We're all invited whether you are 78, or 80. I've told Floyd to send Christopher with a note to Ernest. Janet's already here. She had something to give Master Georgie. Thomas glanced away from his granddaughter and looked at Daisy, smiled at her, then back to Janet, frowning. He needed to remember to talk to Ernest of his concerns. Janet, bright, enthusiastic, was sometimes altogether too keen on a thing and didn't know when she had taken up too much of the conversation. Time and again, Master Georgie would listen to her patiently, hiding his lack of interest with her stories to perfection while Thomas was ready to jump in and take her away. I hope she isn't boring him with something or other, Thomas told Daisy, severely. She gets too into things and, what? Because Daisy Parker was smiling widely and shaking her head, slowly. Hark at you! She exclaimed. What? Thomas demanded. What, Daisy? Whose granddaughter is she? Daisy's features changed to scorn. Yours ... and the apostrophe s ... mine. A person has 4 grandparents, Thomas Barrow, Daisy pointed out, and cast her eyes to the stairs as Janet was holding up a piece of paper for Master Georgie to see. He seemed equally absorbed. Don't you see Milo sitting there? Heavens, Thomas, it could be 60 years ago and I could be cooking her a supper and giving her apple pips to play with. Thomas was about to say something cutting, but couldn't. Daisy couldn't be more correct if she tried. And then there was the fact that he himself was not Janet's blood relative. He strode over to them, and Janet had got up, giving Thomas a nervous smile. Master Georgie nodding towards Thomas and stepping over to him. Will you be so very kind as to join me in the dining room at 7? Barrow? Certainly, my lord, Thomas replied. May I ask to what this concerns? For a moment, his own grandfather was reborn before him, a young Matthew Crawley, fair hair, ice blue eyes. Crinkles of merriment appeared around the corners of his eyes and he nodded to Thomas. You'll see, Barrow, you'll see. He turned to go, but saw Thomas had turned to Janet. What have you got there, girl? He asked, frowning. Thomas realized that Master Georgie was still standing at the foot of the downstairs, and he turned back to him to continue. I have told her she's old enough now to know not to bore people with. But Master Georgie held up a hand and shook his head. Bore. Mr. Barrow, your granddaughter was showing me something if the history of Downton Abbey, a library book that belonged to my great-grandfather, so it turns out, borrowed, with some interesting handwritten notes inside. He held the book towards Thomas, who took it and examined the cover. It was cloth-bound, printed in 1913. He made his face brighten, though he felt that Janet's behavior was still something to be corrected. His mind, usually so clear and calm, now perturbed. Unsettled. G.A. Henty, Thomas commented, his mind wandering. What was Janet doing with it? She came to his mind, but Thomas fought her away. There was a letter at home that he must reply to in Joe uncertain terms. I understand Henty was popular during the Great War. I will put it back in great-grandpapa's library. It was out of Thomas's hands before he could hold on to it. Because. Very good, my lord. Master Georgie still maintained the books when nearly everything else of worth had been sold off to pay for Master George's death duties and the ever-accruing debts. If he went up there after the specialty of Daisy's, Georgie would have meticulously placed it back alphabetically and hopefully whatever this paper was would still be in it. 88,888,888. And so, under Drake's flag sat in the bookshelf, waiting, as the party developed, with everything that Thomas liked. Daisy's food, cooked expertly by his daughter-in-law, graced the table, and discussion flowed. Yes, Christopher was returning to Manchester. Yes, Ernest had been asked to curate the old electrical equipment of his mother's that he had donated to Haxby, now under ownership of the National Trust, for an exhibit called, How We Used to Live. She was Mrs. Talbot now, but Thomas would never stop thinking of her as Lady Mary, and Lady Mary shook her head in disbelief. Surely it was only the other week that we were using a gramophone. It's records now, Grandmama, Master Georgie told her. Yes, Lady Mary replied, sourly. Lady Violet incarnated, The Beatles, the Rolling Stones. Whatever happened to Novlo? She was moving back in, and Thomas was accrediting that her mood was to do with that, and the soon destruction of the Dower House, sold to a building company, which she then mentioned, to the disconsolation of everyone. "But why?" asked Janet, startled, clattering her spoon to her angel delight. "Don't ask such questions," Flora E. Barrow reprimanded her daughter. But George Crawley Jr. looked at her and smiled. "To make room for new developments. God knows I need the money." 88,888,888. A fortnight later dawned bright and clear as Thomas accompanied Ernest and Christopher back to Manchester. It was only when they were standing outside the building that Alan Turing had worked in when Thomas's grandson told his father he had changed his degree to computing. August, when things changed. New terms started, new paths trodden. Except for Thomas, which was exactly as he liked it. Ernest, being Ernest, was happy. Thomas was not. "You'll get a better job in mathematics," Thomas told him. "I will let you talk to him," he told Ernest, and stepped away from them, lighting up a cigarette as Ernest Ashby Barrow held a conference with his son. After a few moments, Ernest looked to Thomas, who came back to join them. "He will do both," Ernest told Thomas. "I will not," Christopher protested, outraged. "You will do both, or neither," Ernest told him severely. "And you will go to Lighthill to tell him yourself." Thomas marveled at his adopted son, most of the time, happy to reside in the background, go with what others wanted, needing little more than his family and his work. When it came to those things that were important, had knew precisely what to say and how to say it. Janet and Christopher couldn't have asked for a better father, which was more than Ernest had had. In reality, Thomas had never shared that his birth father had betrayed Milo. She had been dead for over 20 years, and weeks, months might go by and Thomas wouldn't think of her at all. It was for the best, he thought, considering the mystery of the years she had spent in Germany and, even, what precisely had killed her. That man had used her talent, strung her along and allowed the Nazis to interrogate her without so much as raising a finger to help her. It pained Thomas so much to think about his wife's demise, her one last brave deed saving her son from Tom Branson's bullet, that he ignored as much as he possibly could anything to do with her. "I'm doing both," Christopher told his father and grandfather. Thomas looked at the satisfied expression on Thomas. "Good, that's settled." Thomas nodded. "Get settled then, and we'll go and see Uncle Henry, and you two can talk about his latest discovery." And that evening, Thomas contemplated the letter he had received. Were he to find the bastard, and Thomas meant that literally, he would have no compunction in gutting him. It was beyond that one man now, though, he told himself, as he settled down in Henry Barrow's house, his old home, from which his father had expelled him, for the crime of loving men. "I will do anything to protect your son, I promised you, didn't I?" was Thomas's silent prayer to his long-deceased wife. Happy anniversary. 88,888,888. It was worse than Janet had thought it would be. Companion to Mary Talbot, she had come down with a basket of pastries that her mother had made and to ask Lady Mary to supper, and blinked. Where the apple tree was, that of Grandma, a half-uprooted stump was in the ground, its roots looking like hundreds of serpents crying in their death throes. She threw herself down beside it and put her head on her hands. It was only when Lady Mary stood beside her, wiping tears away, that she realized that this affected the Talbots too. But still Milo's tree, or trees, another, also uprooted, was cast aside, worthlessly strewn, at the top end of the garden. "Oh my dear," Lady Mary explained, as Janet got to her feet, "I thought the buildings would go down, but Grandmama's trees would still be here, and it's gone." "Why?" Janet thought, desperately. "Why?" Lady Mary Talbot gave her a wry smile. "I feel the same," she told Janet, in an uncharacteristic breaking of her own grandmother's life rules. "Never complain, never explain. All my life my own grandmother loved here, then Lady Cora, then me. I kept it so well, with your help, and I intended for Lady Harriet to have it." A bulldozer loomed behind the house, Mechanical Pierre point to the sacrificial doomed dwelling. It is enough. We hope it will be enough that Georgie will not have to sell Downton Abbey. She took to her feet, her own sorrow banking against a damn wall, turning to her home, the Dower House, and clenched her fist, putting it to her forehead. Lady Mary, Janet said, putting her hand on Mary Talbot's raised arm. There were tears in her eyes, which could not be fought back, but she tried anyway. Then Lady Mary turned to look at Janet again, whose eyes were wide, seeing Mary Talbot so emotional, rare to the point of non-existent to her. "Do you remember your grandmother, Melusina?" "Oh, sorry, it was a stupid thing to say. Sometimes I think Georgie is his father and Ernst has just arrived." She turned to me. "That seems like not too long ago." "But it was before you were born." "How can that be?" Lady Mary shook her head. "Because of Albert Einstein," Janet replied, immediately. "Because he explained that time passes at different speeds for different people." Lady Mary took a step back. "What? No. Surely not. Every second lasts a second, every minute a minute." She broke into a smile. "Or your father would not be in business, a maker of clocks that recorded relative time. What good a watch would that be?" Little Janet smiled, on happier ground. "That would be a strange watch." "Indeed," she replied, "your ladyship." "I think under the circumstances." Lady Mary led her from the Dower House gardens and towards the Ashby cottage. "Ernest should stick to what he knows best." Janet pocketed the apple, left behind after the apple tree, Milo's apple tree, had been felled, and offered it to Lady Mary. "It can grow again," she told her. Mary Talbot wrapped the girl's fingers around it. "I am sure of it," she told Janet Barrow. "Melusina lives on." "Now, where is this cup of tea you promised me?" She looked again at the Ashby cottage. "At your parents' house, under the garden of the Dower House, hidden deep in the soil. A secret would lead away from Downton Abbey, and right back again."